Good evening, everybody. This is Cinnamon Noir. Welcome back to Deltarune. And welcome back to the Dark World. This already actually looks very similar to Chapter 1, right down to the little slope we go down. Oh, but this guy's new. Oh, I know, I hated that show too. Oh. Well, and now we see why the wires are not to be trusted. So yeah, just like Chapter 1, there are several sections in this game where there are environmental hazards that will cause your heart to spawn on screen. And if you get hit by them, you'll take damage just as if you were in a battle. These guys all look very traumatized. She's gonna what? Whoops. Well, now we know where that laughter came from. So this is going to be our main antagonist for this chapter. She's called Queen. Or, more accurately, QU5, the whole bunch of characters. She is a very effective, very secure password. Now, of course, this ties in with the theme we had in the last chapter of the card suits. So, of course, there was a Jack, Lancer, and then there was a King, and now we have a Queen. But this Queen actually is not based on card suits, apparently. She's a computer program, just like Tron. Well, you have to have your priorities. By the way, we'll find out eventually that thing she's swirling around in her cup is not a drink, it's battery acid. So, now we apparently know what those guys were worried about earlier. So yes, the Queen sends out little creepy wire tendrils out to transform and mutate the inhabitants of this world into her loyal lackeys. And as usual, the only way for us to help them is to cut the wire. This is similar to when we were thrown in Chapter 1. We would throw characters at, I think it was the crown on top of the checker piece in order to dislodge it. It seems from the way that this chapter works that it's going to become a running theme, that there are characters who you spare by throwing other characters at them. They do some interesting things with it in this particular chapter. I look forward to seeing what they're going to do with the rest of it. So one thing they will do later in this chapter, which is kind of nice, is since it's possible to have trouble with these little mini-games, which help you spare characters, both Susie and Ralsei are eventually going to develop abilities that can just sort of mollify them without your having to do a QuickTime event, which is nice. As you can see early on, I'm having a lot of trouble with these. So if you saw that little recruit 1 out of 6 thing, Ralsei explained this earlier, but the way that you spare characters in this game and manage to get them into the main Dark World is that if you spare enough of them, they will be recruited into the Dark World, and then one representative of them will go there. It's sort of like Starship Mario in Super Mario Galaxy 2. So far, the enemies haven't done anything terribly creative with their attacks, but there are some very interesting enemy attacks in this chapter, which we'll be seeing later. This is the most basic enemy type. They're actually pretty easy. So the fact that the enemies started out tired is kind of a little foreshadowing that Ralsei was going to show up, since we don't know how to spare tired enemies, but Ralsei does. So Susie has actually very little interest in saving Noelle at this point. She just wants to be on another adventure. So this character is kind of interesting. This segment is similar to what happened at the beginning of Chapter 1. But of course, in that chapter, it was Lancer who was throwing stuff at us. Whereas this appears to be some kind of robotic DJ. So here's the background of the Cyber City. Very nice looking. It reminds me of the view of the city from Undertale. So I'm just screwing around a little here to show it off to best advantage. How awesome and awe-inspiring it is. But we need to move on. So yes, this is Cyberworld, and actually, kind of like Ralph Breaks the Internet, or whatever it was called, the theming of this area is very tied into internet culture and how computers work. It's not quite like Tron, because Tron didn't really touch on the internet, but there are some interesting computery things that go on in this playthrough. So with two of these guys, it is pretty difficult because they send out these two different types of attacks. When it's just the sort of firework-style attacks, they're much easier to dodge. The rays that they fire are actually rather difficult because they move unpredictably. That's something you kind of have to get used to. I'm not sure if they always go down to just doing the fireworks attack when you just get down to one of them, but that was my experience playing through this. So you might have noticed there's pictures of the Queen up everywhere. We're going to see that also later on, that the Queen is just sort of a celebrity in this world. This is a curious little machine. These little kind of Sonic the Hedgehog things, where you have to rotate in a circle and pick up those little dots in order to move up. Later ones are going to move up on their own, and the dots are going to have other significances. Like, for instance, in some of them, the dots actually hurt you and you need to avoid them. But I did just realize that I'd avoided that armor, so we should go back and get that. As far as I can tell, there aren't a lot of new weapons and armor. There's not a lot of new weapons and armor in this chapter. What there is, though, can be pretty cool. This chapter focuses a lot less on the battles and a lot more on set pieces, which I actually think is a good idea. The battles can get a little tiring, especially after you've done 3 hours on the first chapter. And of course, anyone who's fought Jevil, which I have not, is definitely going to be a little tired of the battling, because that is a difficult battle. I remember you. So yeah, fairly basic obstacle avoidance puzzle here. It is interesting. I was mentioning earlier how it kind of feels like the different chapters are actually separate games rather than chapters. One of the things about this is that it does take it very easy on you early on, which means it doesn't feel like a Chapter 2, really. It feels more like, honestly, a separate game which has to start off easy and then have the same difficulty progression as earlier. This is one of my problems with this as part of a game, is that Chapter 2 does not have a difficulty curve that starts where Chapter 1 ended. Instead, it seems to reset. This is definitely the danger, from Toby Fox's perspective, of making a game in chunks like this. It may be part of the reason why he decided, at least I think he decided, to make the next 3 chapters all at once. Of course, Chapter 2 is still free. This is still part of the free demo of Deltarune, which really is an amazing deal when you think about it. I think he's decided that with all the money he made from Undertale, he doesn't need a lot of revenue right now. But he did mention that once the next 3 chapters are made and it starts to become more of a proper, complete game, it is going to cost money, and it's going to cost more than Undertale, which frankly just makes perfect sense. So this is a pretty easy puzzle. Like most Undertale puzzles, it never gets terribly involved, but it does get more difficult later on. Oh, and here's another cutscene. So one thing about Queen is that she does have the goofiness of a Papyrus or a Lancer, but she is actually much more sinister than them. Unlike Lancer, she doesn't see being a bad guy as being just, like, cool or, you know, impressing people. She does actually have sinister intentions, and she wants to dominate the world. At first the Dark World, and then eventually all existence. One interesting thing about the Queen is that she doesn't really seem to think of you guys as opposed to her. Like, she assumes that she can win you over very easily and then is kind of shocked and upset when you don't. But that's her character. She thinks it's very easy for her to get people to do what she says. Really, a control freak kind of character. I wouldn't say that any character in any Toby Fox game is realistic, but there's something a little bit realistic about the way Queen pushes people around. So yeah, there's no escaping from this. We have to play. So I say gaming is not my life, which may seem weird since I'm recording a Let's Play, but, you know, there is more to life than video games. For instance, there's eating and sleeping. One thing this chapter does that previous chapters didn't do is have the little text crawls for when characters are talking over each other. I wouldn't say it's completely an elegant solution, but it does allow the dialogue to be a little more dynamic. Certainly more dynamic than Undertale, where it was almost always one character talking to Frisk, who doesn't talk. Oh, and here's Ralsei trying to imitate Lancer's stool form, which of course is foolish, because Lancer is the only one who knows how to do that. And Susie has a form that really doesn't help at all. And see, yeah, Ralsei just had the terrible form there. Doesn't work at all. But at least now we can play the video game. And it's Punch-Out! It is almost literally Punch-Out! If anything, the only real difference is it's more forgiving than Punch-Out! For instance, most of the dodges you can do in this game, whether you do left, right, or back, almost all of them work. This is just a simple little minigame. It's a little goofy. But I like it a lot. It's actually fairly well programmed. It feels good to play. It's nice and punchy. The hits feel good. Really, it feels just as fun to play as Punch-Out, even though it is much, much easier. Which, considering how difficult Punch-Out is, I don't think that's at all a bad thing. Notice also how the Queen is not moving her hands at all. I guess, being a computer program, she doesn't actually have to play the video game. Your head explode. By the way, if you think that's a weird Homestar Runner reference, Toby Fox is going to have a Homestar Runner reference of his own later on. So naturally, being a hero, I choose to perish rather than submit. So Susie tells Queen to get out, and she does. I guess that just shows how forceful Susie's personality really is. No, but that isn't the last we've seen of Queen by a long shot. Anyway, I solved the last puzzle, but I actually failed to go and get the reward for it when I did it. I do weird things like that sometimes. So, there's a treasure chest here with a nice little... That's actually a weapon, so now that I think about it, it doesn't help me at all. One thing about this game is that, like Undertale, even though the game doesn't really want you to fight enemies, fighting them is the only way to increase your character's HP. So, if you don't fight, it does make things a little harder in some senses. So this is Nubbert. He's a very Toby Fox-like character in that he's very simple, but everyone apparently loves him for obscure reasons. Nubbert also says he'll give us his treasure, but we actually already took it, so we kind of beat him to the punch there. Poor Nubbert. I've heard people say that Nubbert is supposed to be based on the little nub that's on some laptops, definitely older laptops, where it's used in place of a trackpad. Oh, those two guys look kind of familiar. Not 100% though. So, these two guys are selling CD bagels, which, as far as I could tell, would just be a CD. These guys are offering quite a deal. You can get 400 bagels for $80, but I think that's more than I can probably hold, so I'm not interested in that. I will, however, buy a single CD bagel. Might seem like a boondoggle, but actually, CD bagels are a pretty good healing item. Later on, you can get them for less money, but there's no good reason not to get at least one right now. One thing I noticed about this chapter is that some of the fights are actually quite hard, so you will be wanting some healing items. If you're fortunate enough to have saved some revive mints from the last chapter, that's definitely a good idea. And here's a character who's going after blue check marks, because of course. He also vaguely resembles Bill Cipher from Gravity Falls, but he's not as good a character. There is, however, another character in this game who is a lot like Bill Cipher personality-wise, and who is a great character, so let's be holding out for that. So these are tasks. They're basically dogs, as far as I can tell. Now, these enemies actually have a fairly simple attack pattern, and are fairly easy to get to the point where you can spare them. So I would actually say these guys are even easier than the live wires or whatever they were called. It just goes to show that in a game like this, you really can't tell how hard an enemy is going to be by how it looks. In Paper Mario, for instance, an enemy that big would definitely have been much harder than the ordinary mooks we've been dealing with up to now. And that guy got stuck in a window. These glitches are terrible, man. I will say I haven't found any glitches in Deltarune at all, which that shouldn't be too impressive, but unfortunately, given the way most people make games these days, I have to give Toby Fox some credit for not making a glitchy game. So here's Viro-Kun. I have no idea what they're supposed to be, but I'm wondering if they're supposed to be viruses, given their names. And you do take care of them, and the game says they look healthy, so I think that might actually be what they are. Very quickly dealt with those guys. Their attack is interesting. They shoot arrows at you, and then the arrows turn into a little guy that chases you around. But the attack segment doesn't really last long enough for that to be much of a problem. So I mess up this puzzle early on, but the second time through I get it. After my embarrassing performance in the last chapter, I did decide to get a little better at doing puzzles. And there we go. Oh, great. We typed agree to all, which means we agreed to her end-user license agreement. Which is actually very similar to something that happened in Icarus Proudbottom Teaches Typing. If you remember some of my very much older Let's Plays that I did with Greg. That's one of my favorites, actually, just because that was such a weird game. I wonder if those guys have done anything else. That was also a very creative game studio that used a fairly simple framework, actually one that was designed for visual novels, to do some interesting things with the game. Toby Fox is a great game designer, but I definitely think there are a lot of other people who are doing interesting things with games these days. Oh, so here's more of these things. And there's that guy again. So this boombox guy actually is giving us some useful advice. The right one is the correct one if we want to move forward. However, in order to get through it, we do actually have to pick up all these little purple dots, which I'm failing at right now. This is just for a treasure chest, so of course it is the hardest one. But I do figure it out eventually. I don't know how randomized that is. Yep. Thanks a lot, Toby Fox. You know, there's a thing in Lisa the Painful RPG where there's a very long ladder that you climb up, and when you get to the top, there's literally just a statue of a giant hand with its middle finger extended. Toby Fox has never done anything quite like that, but I think this particular puzzle very effectively conveyed exactly the same impression. For all I know, there's probably some secret hidden boss behind it. There's so many hidden things in Deltarune and Undertale, but I don't have any patience to try to tease them out. I'm not much of a game hacker. So yeah, this puzzle at first looks like it should be very challenging, but the fact that you can actually leave and come back means that it's not too difficult to find out where you can go in order to just redo it. And there you go, it's that simple. I guess it's not simple because it glitched. It is kind of funny that if you play a Bethesda game, the game's not about glitches, but it's full of glitches, whereas this game is very much about glitches, but it doesn't have any real ones. It's also what Carol Blaster is like, actually. Speaking of other games I've Let's Played. And this, of course, being the one that leads to progress, is the simplest one. Doesn't require any effort. Oh, there's that guy again. So, I like to say I got better at the puzzles, but I actually did a miserable job at this. I don't know how I survived, because I get hit way too much. But the game does take a little mercy on you after a while. Appropriately enough. I do decide before moving on that I'd better get Chris up a little bit from where I put him. Oh. So I think it's time for a dance-off battle. So I mentioned earlier a Homestar reference. This is it. Sweet Cappin' Cakes is pretty clearly a reference to Sweet Cuppin' Cakes, which is the name of a fictional cartoon from the Strong Bad universe. And you would think maybe I'm going a little... maybe I'm reading a little too much into this, but in fact they have a jingle that is almost exactly the same as a jingle that plays when that fictional cartoon is shown. So I think it definitely is a deliberate reference. And this is it. It's extremely similar. It even has the same tone on it, which is like an old Casio keyboard. Actually, the character in Sweet Cuppin' Cakes who makes that sound is an animated Casio keyboard, so... So this is an interesting little game. First of all, I love the setting here. One nice thing about the way Toby Fox designs encounters is that since it's all based around a little square with your heart in it, he can create background elements that fit in with it. I guess what I'm saying is, since it's a simple, basic structure, he can modify it a lot without it becoming too confusing. So this is a little music battle. It's got a nice little track that goes along with it. You should probably find out early on that the goal is to get all these guys to dance. The thing is, though, from Chapter 1 you've probably gotten used to doing those X moves where you use everybody's abilities at the same time. And if you do that here, that's actually counterproductive because you can only make them dance for one move, and after it they'll immediately snap out of it. So if you want them all to dance at the same time, spoiler, you actually have to have each of your heroes individually do a dance and get one of the opponents to dance. So this, I think, is kind of, not exactly a wake-up call battle, but it's a battle that teaches you that using the ability where everyone pitches in at the same time isn't actually always the most effective. In fact, it can be counterproductive, as it is in this battle. The dodging element of this battle is also interesting because the way the little notes move pushes you up to the top of the screen. But the top of the screen is the most dangerous part with the stuff that's raining down from the top. So you kind of have to come up with a happy medium, which is very similar to the way most of these things work. I have to wonder if KK is a reference to Animal Crossing, where There's KK Slider, of course, who's the musician. Now here we go. So, I'd forgotten, you actually can't all dance at once until your other characters learn to get into it. This is important, so the S action that Susie can perform, and the R action that Ralsei can perform are something that's going to be very helpful throughout this chapter, and I presume for the rest of Deltarune. In this case, it makes them dance, so that you can make all of your opponents dance. So what's said is, you know, why is Chris the only one that can act? But in fact, for the other two, it's shown as a form of magic. I also like how Chris is doing the Cossack dance here. And, yeah, this little sequence ensues. It's much better than Balan Wonderworld, which is the other thing that came out recently that's kind of like this. But in that game, it was just confusing and a little bit creepy, whereas here, it's pretty fun. And we get a splash screen that you don't see at any other point in the game, I believe. But who knows, maybe it'll show up again in Chapter 5 or something. So yeah, unfortunately they couldn't slam and do the jam as well as we could, which means they've lost. Except they actually think that they've won, and it means that we're on their side. Actually, they're on our side. But the important thing is that we both hate the Queen. So yeah, now we're friends with these guys, and they won't hurt us anymore. At least I presume not. I like this little section. So, Susie and Ralsei don't follow you at this point because they get so absorbed in watching the fireworks show. It's a nice little bit of set-piece design right there. But as soon as they got off the treadmill, they're ready to follow you again. So it looks like the way into the city is open now. That's a door frame, just like in Chapter 1. We need to find 2 of those door frames in order to warp between different areas. I don't find in this game that it's very helpful much to warp back and forth, but anyway, we'll see that later on. Good night, everybody.